The blood-red sunset painted the harsh Montana landscape as Elizabeth Edwards stood at the edge of the homestead she had just inherited from her late aunt. The doctor's words still echoed in her mind, each syllable a knife to her heart. "Your scarring is too severe. You will never bear children." At 22, she had come west to escape those words, to build a new life away from the pitying glances of Philadelphia society. The year was 1873, and the western frontier offered what the East could not, a chance to reinvent herself where no one knew her past. Elizabeth wiped away a tear with the back of her hand, her calloused fingers evidence of the month she had spent trying to restore the small ranch to working order. The place wasn't much, a modest cabin, a small barn in need of repair, and 15 acres of land that bordered the larger Double Creek Ranch. But it was hers, all hers, and if she couldn't have a family, she would pour her heart into this patch of earth. "Madam, you might want to get inside." "Storm's brewing." The deep voice startled her, and Elizabeth whirled around to find a tall man on horseback regarding her with concern. His features were partially hidden by the shadow of his hat, but she could see kind eyes studying her tear-stained face. "I'm quite all right, thank you," she said, straightening her spine and forcing dignity into her voice. He dismounted with fluid grace that spoke of a lifetime in the saddle. "Isaac Xavier," he said, removing his hat. "I run the Double Creek next door. Been meaning to come by and introduce myself since you arrived." Up close, Elizabeth could see he was perhaps 30, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His eyes were a striking blue like the summer sky after a storm had cleared. "Elizabeth Edwards," she replied, extending her hand formally. "I inherited this property from my Aunt Margaret." Isaac's handshake was firm but gentle. "Old Maggie was a good neighbor, sorry for your loss." He glanced at the sagging fence line and half-repaired barn. "Looks like you've been busy." "Yes, well," Elizabeth gestured vaguely at the property, "there's quite a bit to do." A gust of wind brought the scent of rain, and Isaac looked toward the gathering clouds. "That fence won't hold your livestock when the storm hits. I've got some spare lumber in my wagon. Mind if I help?" Elizabeth hesitated. In Philadelphia, accepting help from a man she'd just met would be scandalous. But this wasn't Philadelphia, and the darkening sky promised a deluge that would likely wash away what little progress she'd made on the fence. "I would appreciate that," she finally said. For the next hour, they worked side by side, hammering the fence posts more securely into the ground and replacing broken boards. Elizabeth was no stranger to hard work, having helped in her father's carpentry shop before his death, but Isaac's efficiency was impressive. His movements were economical, practiced, and she found herself watching his hands strong and capable as they worked the wood. "How long have you been out west?" he asked as they finished the last section. "Just over a month," Elizabeth replied, wiping sweat from her brow. "Though it feels much longer," Isaac chuckled. "The frontier has a way of aging a person quickly. You planning to work this place alone?" The question stung more than it should have. "Yes," she said shortly. "I am." He seemed to sense her discomfort. No offense meant. "It's just tough country for anyone alone, man or woman." The first heavy raindrops began to fall as they gathered the tools. "You should come in for coffee," Elizabeth said, surprising herself with the invitation. As thanks, Isaac hesitated, then nodded. "That's mighty kind." Inside the small cabin, Elizabeth busied herself with the stove while Isaac removed his hat and coat, hanging them by the door. The cabin was simple but clean, with a small sitting area, a kitchen corner, and a curtained-off sleeping space. She had added small touches to make it homier: a quilt on the chair, wildflowers in a jar, books stacked on a small shelf. "How many cattle do you have?" Isaac asked, accepting the steaming cup she offered. 6, Elizabeth admitted, "and 2 horses." "It's not much, but it's a start," he finished for her. "Everyone starts somewhere." His kindness, offered without pity, loosened something in her chest. "My father was a carpenter in Philadelphia. I know little about ranching, but I'm learning. What brought you all the way out here?" Isaac asked, his eyes curious but not intrusive. Elizabeth stared into her cup. "I needed a change. After my father died last year, there was nothing left for me in the East. And no husband to object to you moving halfway across the country." The question was casual, but Elizabeth felt her guard rise. "No," she said firmly. "No husband." They sat in companionable silence as the rain hammered against the roof. Elizabeth found herself studying Isaac when he wasn't looking the way he held his cup, the thoughtful expression on his face as he gazed out the window, the small scar at the corner of his jaw. "I lost my wife 3 years ago," he said suddenly. "Fever took her and our baby." The admission caught Elizabeth off guard. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Isaac nodded, his eyes distant. "Been running Double Creek alone since then. It gets quiet?" "Yes," Elizabeth whispered. "It does." When the rain eased, Isaac rose to leave. At the door, he turned back to her. "The county fair is next Saturday in town. If you'd like, I could show you around, introduce you to some folks." Elizabeth hesitated. She'd been keeping to herself, making only necessary trips to town for supplies. But the prospect of spending more time with this quiet, capable man was surprisingly appealing. "I would like that," she said. His smile transformed his face, making him look younger. "I'll come by around noon then." After he left, Elizabeth stood at the window, watching him ride away through the misty aftermath of the storm. For the first time since arriving in Montana, she felt less alone. The week passed in a blur of work, with Elizabeth rising at dawn each day to tend to her small herd and continue repairs on the property. By Friday evening, she had cleaned the cabin thoroughly and laid out her best dress, a simple blue cotton that brought out the amber flecks in her hazel eyes. She chided herself for the extra care she was taking with her appearance, but couldn't deny the flutter of anticipation in her stomach. Saturday dawned clear and warm. Elizabeth was just pinning up her chestnut hair when she heard the sound of a wagon approaching. Isaac was prompt, arriving exactly at noon, wearing a clean shirt and his least weathered hat. When Elizabeth emerged from the cabin, his appreciative gaze made her cheeks warm. "You look lovely, Miss Edwards," he said, helping her into the wagon. "Elizabeth, please," she corrected him with a small smile. "Elizabeth," he repeated, and something about the way he said her name made her heart beat faster. The county fair was a lively affair, with farmers and ranchers from miles around gathered to showcase livestock, produce, and handicrafts. Music from a small band filled the air, mingling with the laughter of children and the calls of vendors selling refreshments. Isaac seemed to know everyone, introducing Elizabeth to so many people she quickly lost track of names. But she noticed how respected he was. Men nodded deferentially, women smiled warmly, children called greetings. He moved through the crowd with easy confidence, his hand occasionally coming to rest lightly on the small of her back to guide her through the throng. "Isaac Xavier. You finally decided to join the living again." A robust woman with silver-streaked dark hair approached them, her smile wide. "Mrs. Donovan," Isaac greeted her with a grin. "This is Miss Elizabeth Edwards, who's taken over Maggie's place." "Elizabeth, this is Beatrice Donovan, who runs the general store and knows everything about everyone." "Don't you listen to him," Beatrice said, taking Elizabeth's hand warmly. "I'm just observant is all. And what I observe is that Isaac hasn't brought a lady to the fair since—" She stopped abruptly, glancing at Isaac. "Since Abigail," Isaac finished quietly. "It's all right, B." Elizabeth felt the weight of this revelation. She wasn't just any neighbor. He was being kind to. This outing meant something more. As they walked away, Isaac said softly, "I hope that didn't make you uncomfortable." Elizabeth shook her head. "Not at all, though I wonder if I'm causing gossip." Isaac laughed. "In a town this size, breathing causes gossip." His expression grew more serious. "But if it bothers you—" "It doesn't," Elizabeth said firmly, and she found that it truly didn't. There was something freeing about being here where no one knew of her condition or felt sorry for her because of it. They spent the afternoon exploring the fair. Isaac bought her lemonade and ribbon candy, and they watched the horse races together, his shoulder occasionally brushing against hers as they stood at the rail. When the band began playing for dancing, Isaac hesitated, then offered his hand. "I'm not much of a dancer," he admitted, "but if you'd like—" Elizabeth placed her hand in his. "Neither am I, but I'm willing if you are." His hands were warm and steady as he guided her through a simple waltz. Elizabeth couldn't remember the last time she had danced, perhaps at her father's funeral reception when propriety had demanded it. But this was different. This was joyful, with no shadows hanging over her. Just the music, the late afternoon sun, and Isaac's blue eyes locked on hers. As the day wound down, they walked to the wagon in comfortable silence. The drive back to her homestead seemed to pass too quickly. When they arrived, Isaac helped her down, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for today," Elizabeth said. "I can't remember when I've enjoyed myself more." Isaac's gaze was warm. "The pleasure was mine." He hesitated, then added, "I was wondering if you might join me for Sunday dinner tomorrow. Nothing fancy, just a meal that isn't eaten alone." "I'd like that very much," Elizabeth replied. After he left, Elizabeth sat on her porch steps, watching the sunset and trying to make sense of her feelings. She had come west to escape, to build a life without the expectations that had crushed her in Philadelphia. She hadn't come looking for a man, especially not one who would inevitably want children she couldn't give him. Yet there was something about Isaac Xavier that called to her wounded heart. His quiet strength, his lack of pretense, the shadow of loss in his eyes that matched her own. For the first time since the doctor had delivered his devastating news, Elizabeth allowed herself to wonder if perhaps there might be a different kind of future waiting for her after all. Sunday dinner at Double Creek Ranch revealed a side of Isaac that Elizabeth hadn't fully glimpsed before. His home was larger than her cabin, but possessed the same frontier simplicity, sturdy furniture built for function rather than fashion. A few treasured books on shelves, and unexpectedly, a piano in the corner of the main room. "It was Abigail's," Isaac explained when he caught Elizabeth looking at it. "I couldn't bear to part with it, though I don't play." "I do," Elizabeth said softly. "My mother taught me before she passed. Would you?" Isaac gestured toward the instrument. Elizabeth sat on the bench and ran her fingers over the keys. It had been tuned recently, she realized with surprise. She began to play a simple melody, one her mother had loved. The music filled the room, and when she glanced up, Isaac was watching her with an expression that made her heart skip. "That was beautiful," he said when she finished. "This house hasn't had music in it for too long." Over dinner, a surprisingly well-prepared roast with vegetables from his garden, Elizabeth learned more about Isaac's life. He had come west as a young man of 19, working as a ranch hand before saving enough to stake his claim. He'd met Abigail in town. She was a schoolteacher from Ohio who had come west for adventure. "We had 3 good years," Isaac said, his voice soft with remembrance. "She was carrying our first child when the fever hit. I lost them both in the same night." Elizabeth reached across the table and laid her hand over his. "I'm so sorry, Isaac." He turned his hand to clasp hers. "For a long time, I just existed. Worked from sunrise to sunset, fell into bed too exhausted to dream, but lately..." His eyes met hers. "Lately, I've been thinking there might be more to life than just surviving it." The air between them seemed to thicken. Elizabeth knew she should tell him about her condition. It wasn't fair to let him hope for something she couldn't give. But the words stuck in her throat, selfish in her desire to preserve this moment, this connection, a little longer. "Tell me about Philadelphia," Isaac said, breaking the tension. "What was your life like there?" Elizabeth told him about growing up as a carpenter's daughter, helping in her father's shop despite society's disapproval, learning to read blueprints before romance novels. She spoke of her mother's early death, the subsequent closeness with her father, and his passing the previous year. "After he died, I felt adrift," she admitted. "When I received word that Aunt Margaret had left me her property, it seemed like providence. A chance to start fresh where no one knew me or had expectations of what I should be." "And what should you be, Elizabeth Edwards?" Isaac asked, his gaze intent. She looked away. "In Philadelphia, a woman my age should be married with children, or at least actively seeking a husband." "And that's not what you wanted?" The question hung between them, demanding truth. Elizabeth chose her words carefully. "I wanted different things, freedom to make my own choices, to build something that was mine." It wasn't a lie, not exactly. But it wasn't the whole truth either, and the omission weighed on her as they finished their meal and she prepared to leave. At her wagon, Isaac took her hand. I'd like to see you again, Elizabeth, not just as neighbors. His directness was refreshing after the circuitous courtship rituals of the East. I'd like that too, she said honestly. His smile was like sunrise. Good, because I plan to call on you properly, and call he did. Over the next few weeks, Isaac became a regular presence at Elizabeth's homestead. He arrived with practical gifts: fence posts, seeds for her garden, a repaired plow, but also small treasures that showed he was thinking of her. Wildflower honey from a local beekeeper, a book of poetry he'd found in town, a handkerchief he'd asked Beatrice Donovan to embroider with Elizabeth's initials. They fell into an easy rhythm of shared work and companionship. Isaac taught Elizabeth about cattle breeding and range management. She showed him more efficient ways to repair his cabin's furniture. They took picnic lunches under the cottonwood trees by the creek that gave his ranch its name, talking for hours about everything and nothing. Elizabeth found herself falling for this quiet, strong man who saw the world with such clarity, who treated her as an equal, valued her opinions, and never once suggested she couldn't manage her ranch because she was a woman, who made her laugh with dry observations about their neighbors and touched her heart with his gentleness toward injured animals and children in town. And yet, as autumn approached and their relationship deepened, the secret between them grew heavier. Elizabeth knew she needed to tell him the truth before things went any further, but each time she tried, fear stopped her. Fear that the warmth in his eyes would turn to disappointment or, worse, pity. The opportunity came one evening in late September. They had spent the day bringing in the last of her garden harvest, and Isaac had stayed to help her preserve some of the vegetables for winter. As they worked side by side in her small kitchen, Elizabeth felt a contentment she had never known before. "I could get used to this," Isaac said softly, watching her seal a jar of pickled beans. Elizabeth's hands stilled. "To what?" "This," he gestured between them. "Working together. Building something together." Her heart raced. "Isaac." He set down the knife he was using and turned to face her fully. "I know it hasn't been that long, Elizabeth, but I've never been more certain of anything. I love you. I want to court you properly with an eye toward marriage if you'll have me." The words she had longed to hear now filled her with dread. "There's something you need to know first," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Isaac took her hands, concern replacing the hope in his eyes. "Whatever it is, we can face it together." Elizabeth took a deep breath. 3 years ago, I became very ill with a fever. The doctors, they said the infection caused scarring, internal scarring." She swallowed hard. "I can never have children, Isaac, never." She forced herself to look at him, to watch as understanding dawned in his eyes. She expected to see disappointment, perhaps even rejection. Instead, what she saw was compassion, deep and genuine. "Is that why you came west, to escape that knowledge?" Elizabeth nodded, tears threatening. "In Philadelphia, a woman's primary value is in her ability to bear children, to continue family lines. When word spread about my condition, the suitors disappeared, the invitations dwindled, even my father's friends looked at me differently with pity." Her voice broke. I couldn't bear it anymore. Isaac reached up to brush a tear from her cheek. "And you thought I would feel the same way, wouldn't you?" Elizabeth asked, her vulnerability laid bare. "You lost your child. Surely you want the chance to be a father someday." Isaac was quiet for a long moment, his thumbs tracing gentle circles on the backs of her hands. "Yes," he finally said, "I do want to be a father someday, but Elizabeth, family isn't just about blood." He led her to the small table and sat beside her, still holding her hands. "My own parents died when I was 14. I was raised by my father's best friend and his wife, people who had no obligation to me but took me in anyway. They taught me that family is about love, not just bloodlines." Hope flickered in Elizabeth's chest, but she dared not let it grow. "But your own child, there are children who need homes," Isaac said simply. "Orphans from the war. Children who lose parents to illness or accident. The Reverend's wife was just telling me last Sunday about a family back east looking to place 3 children because their mother died and their father can't care for them alone." He squeezed her hands. "We'll make a family anyway, Elizabeth, if you'll have me." The dam broke, and Elizabeth's tears flowed freely. You truly mean that? You wouldn't resent me for what I can't give you? Isaac shook his head, his own eyes suspiciously bright. How could I resent the woman who brought music and laughter back into my life? Who looks at this harsh land and sees possibility instead of hardship? Who works alongside me as if she was born to it? He leaned forward and with infinite tenderness pressed his lips to hers. It was a gentle kiss, a promise, and when he pulled back, Elizabeth saw her future reflected in his eyes. I love you, Elizabeth Edwards. Nothing changes that. For the first time since the doctor had delivered his verdict, Elizabeth felt whole again. Not broken or lacking, but simply herself, a woman capable of loving and being loved. I love you too, she whispered, and the words felt like coming home. Their courtship continued through the autumn months, but now without the shadow of Elizabeth's secret between them. Isaac spoke openly about adoption, researching options and corresponding with agencies back east. Elizabeth found herself daring to imagine a future filled with children's laughter not from her womb, but from her heart. In late October, they attended the Harvest Festival together. As they walked among the stalls, Elizabeth noticed Isaac's gaze lingering on a young boy who was trying unsuccessfully to lift a large pumpkin. Need some help there, partner? Isaac called, approaching the child. The boy looked up, his face smudged with dirt and his clothes worn but clean. Yes, sir, I'm trying to bring this home for my sister, but it's mighty heavy. Where's your pa? Isaac asked, easily hoisting the pumpkin. The boy's face fell. He died in the mine collapse last spring. It's just me and my sister now. She takes in washing. Elizabeth and Isaac exchanged glances. What's your name, son? Isaac asked gently. Thomas, sir, Thomas Miller. My sister is Sarah. Well, Thomas, why don't we deliver this pumpkin together? Miss Edwards and I have a wagon. The boy's small shack on the outskirts of town revealed a dire situation. Sarah Miller, barely 19, was doing her best to care for her 10-year-old brother, but the approaching winter promised hardship they might not survive. The girl was painfully thin, with a persistent cough that worried Elizabeth immediately. As they drove away, having left the pumpkin and some extra provisions from their own supplies, Elizabeth saw the determination in Isaac's jaw. We need to help them, she said, already knowing they were of one mind. Isaac nodded. Winter's coming. That girl won't last working outside with wet laundry in the cold. Over the next few weeks, they visited the Millers regularly. Elizabeth brought Sarah herbal remedies for her cough and taught her to make heartier stews with less expensive cuts of meat. Isaac took Thomas under his wing, teaching him ranch skills and paying him small wages to help with chores. By November, it was clear that Sarah's health was deteriorating despite their help. After a particularly bad coughing fit, Elizabeth insisted on staying the night to tend to her. You've both been so kind, Sarah whispered as Elizabeth bathed her fevered brow. But I worry about Thomas. If something happens to me. Nothing will happen, Elizabeth said firmly, though her medical knowledge, limited as it was, told her otherwise. But Thomas will always be cared for, I promise you that. When Isaac arrived the next morning, Elizabeth met him outside. Consumption, she said quietly. I've seen it before. She doesn't have long. Isaac removed his hat, pain evident in his eyes. That boy will be alone. Elizabeth took his hands. Not if we take him in. Isaac's gaze met hers, understanding passing between them. Are you sure? It's sooner than we planned. I've never been more certain, Elizabeth replied. That child needs us. They spoke with Sarah that afternoon, offering to become Thomas's legal guardians. The relief in the young woman's eyes was heartbreaking. You're good people, she whispered. I've prayed for someone like you. 3 days later, Sarah Miller passed peacefully in her sleep, with Elizabeth holding her hand and Thomas asleep in the next room. The funeral was small but dignified, with Isaac covering all expenses and Reverend Thompson speaking eloquently of Sarah's courage and devotion to her brother. Thomas moved into Elizabeth's cabin the same day, bringing his few possessions in a small sack. He was quiet with grief, but accepted Elizabeth's gentle comfort and Isaac's steady presence. That night, after Thomas had finally fallen asleep in the small room Elizabeth had prepared for him, she and Isaac sat on the porch steps, watching the stars emerge. I think we should get married, Isaac said simply. Soon, for Thomas's sake and for ours. Elizabeth leaned against his shoulder. Yes, she said. I think we should. They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the church, with Thomas standing proudly as Isaac's best man and Beatrice Donovan serving as Elizabeth's matron of honor. The town turned out in force to celebrate, bringing food and gifts and well wishes for the new family. Are you sure this is proper? Elizabeth had worried to Reverend Thompson before the ceremony. Everything's happening so quickly and with Thomas. The Reverend had smiled kindly. My dear, there is nothing more proper in God's eyes than two people coming together to create a home for a child who needs one. Love makes a family, not convention. As Elizabeth spoke her vows to Isaac, she felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This wasn't the life she had envisioned for herself, but it was infinitely better, richer, and more meaningful than anything she could have imagined back in Philadelphia. That evening, after a wedding supper at what was now their home, they had decided to make Elizabeth's cabin their primary residence, as it was newer and in better repair than Isaac's. They tucked Thomas into bed. Are you my pa now? The boy asked Isaac sleepily. Isaac glanced at Elizabeth, then back at Thomas. I'd be honored to be your pa if you'll have me, but I don't want to replace your real father in your heart. Thomas considered this solemnly. I think my pa would want me to have a new pa to teach me things, and a ma too. He looked at Elizabeth with a shy smile. I never had a ma before. Elizabeth's heart swelled as she leaned down to kiss his forehead. Well, you have one now, forever. Later, alone in their bedroom, Isaac took Elizabeth in his arms. How are you feeling, Mrs. Xavier? The new name sent a thrill through her. Happy, she said honestly. Complete. Isaac's kiss was tender at first, then deepened with passion that had been restrained during their courtship. I never thought I'd feel this way again, he murmured against her lips. You've given me back my future, Elizabeth. And you've given me a family, she whispered back, something I thought was lost to me forever. Their lovemaking was gentle and unhurried, a sacred sealing of the promises they had made. Elizabeth, who had feared this moment might be shadowed by what her body couldn't do, instead found herself fully present in the joy of their union. Isaac's touch was reverent, his whispered words of love healing the last wounded places in her heart. Winter settled over the Montana territory with a fierce determination that year. Snow piled high around the cabin and temperatures dropped to bitter lows. But inside, warmth prevailed. Isaac moved his cattle closer to Elizabeth's property, combining their herds and making it easier to care for the animals in the harsh conditions. Thomas thrived under their care, gaining weight and color in his cheeks, excelling at his lessons when Elizabeth taught him reading and arithmetic in the evenings. They established rituals as a family Sunday readings from the Bible, Friday night checkers tournaments that Thomas increasingly won, and music whenever the weather kept them indoors too long. Elizabeth played the piano that Isaac had carefully moved from his house to theirs and taught Thomas simple melodies. Isaac revealed a surprisingly pleasant singing voice, and their home was often filled with song. Christmas brought special joy. Elizabeth and Thomas decorated the cabin with pine boughs and red berries, while Isaac mysteriously disappeared into town for several days, returning with packages he refused to let them see. On Christmas Eve, they exchanged gifts, practical items mostly, like new gloves and boots, but also treasures. A carved wooden horse for Thomas, a leather-bound journal for Elizabeth, a new harmonica for Isaac. But the greatest gift came on Christmas morning when a knock at the door revealed Reverend Thompson standing in the snow beside a small, bundled figure. "Merry Christmas," the Reverend said. "I've brought someone who needs a home if you're still interested." Isaac and Elizabeth exchanged surprised glances. They had written to an orphanage in Denver about possibly adopting a child in the spring, but hadn't expected anything to come of it so soon. "This is Emma," Reverend Thompson said, ushering the child forward. "She's 6 years old and was being transported to the orphanage in Billings when their wagon broke down outside town. The others continued on, but I thought, well, I remembered your interest." Emma was tiny for her age, with a mass of dark curls and solemn eyes that regarded them warily. She clutched a worn rag doll to her chest like a shield. Elizabeth knelt to the child's level. "Hello, Emma. I'm Elizabeth, and this is my husband Isaac and our son Thomas. Would you like to come in where it's warm?" The little girl nodded cautiously, her eyes darting around the cabin as she entered. When she spotted the Christmas decorations and the small gifts still scattered around, her eyes widened. "Is it Christmas?" she whispered. "It is," Isaac said gently. "Would you like to stay and celebrate with us?" "Maybe for a while, to see if you like it here." Emma looked from Isaac to Elizabeth to Thomas, who was watching her with undisguised curiosity. "Do you have other children?" she asked. "Just Thomas," Elizabeth answered, "but we have room in our hearts and our home for more." "My mama died," Emma said suddenly, "and my papa left and never came back." Isaac crouched beside Elizabeth. "We know what it's like to lose people we love, Emma, but we also know that sometimes, if you're very lucky, you can find a new family, one that chooses you specially." The little girl seemed to consider this carefully. "Can my doll stay too?" she finally asked. Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes. "Of course she can. What's her name?" "Rose," Emma said, holding out the doll for inspection. One button eye was missing and the dress was tattered. "Well, Rose is very welcome here," Elizabeth said, "and I think she might need a new dress. Would you like to help me make one for her?" Emma nodded, a tiny smile appearing for the first time. "Yes, please." The Reverend departed after staying for breakfast, promising to return with the necessary paperwork once the roads cleared. Emma was quiet but watchful throughout the day, observing their family dynamics with the wariness of a child who had known too much uncertainty. That night, as Elizabeth tucked Emma into the small trundle bed they had hastily prepared in her and Isaac's room, the little girl asked, "Are you going to be my new mama?" Elizabeth's heart caught. "Would you like that, Emma?" Emma nodded solemnly. "My real mama told me that if anything happened to her, she would send me to a good mama who needed me. Are you a mama who needs me?" Elizabeth gathered the child into her arms, tears flowing freely now. "Oh, Emma, I have needed you my whole life without even knowing it." By spring, the adoption papers for both Thomas and Emma had been finalized. The children had settled into life on the ranch with the resilience of youth, though not without challenges. Thomas had nightmares about the mine collapse that had killed his father. Emma sometimes reverted to silence when overwhelmed by new experiences. But with patience and consistent love, Isaac and Elizabeth watched their children bloom. They expanded the cabin that summer, adding 2 proper bedrooms for the children and enlarging the main living area. Isaac's cattle business prospered, and Elizabeth started a small side business selling preserves and baked goods in town, using recipes her mother had taught her. Word of their growing family spread, and occasionally Reverend Thompson would bring news of another child in need of temporary shelter or a permanent home. By the time autumn returned, they had welcomed a 3rd child, 8-year-old William, whose parents had both died of influenza while traveling west. The boy was mechanically inclined, constantly taking apart and reassembling anything he could get his hands on. Isaac built him a small workbench, and Elizabeth secretly arranged for a set of junior carpentry tools to be delivered from Denver for his birthday. "We're going to need a bigger house at this rate," Isaac commented one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the 3 children chase fireflies in the yard. Elizabeth leaned against his shoulder. "Are you complaining, Mr. Xavier?" He kissed the top of her head. "Not for a moment, Mrs. Xavier. I'm just thinking we might need to consider building something new, designed for a larger family from the start." The idea took root, and by the following spring, construction had begun on a new, larger home halfway between Elizabeth's original cabin and Isaac's property. The design incorporated ideas from both of them: large windows to let in natural light, a spacious kitchen where Elizabeth could teach the children to cook, separate bedrooms for each child, and a special music room for the piano. As the house took shape, so did their reputation in the community. The Xaviers became known as a haven for children in need, whether for temporary care during a family crisis or for permanent adoption when no other options existed. Elizabeth, who had once feared her inability to bear children would define her life, instead found herself surrounded by more children than she could have imagined. Not all stayed permanently. Some were reunited with extended family or found other homes. But each child who passed through their care carried away the knowledge that they were valued and loved. 5 years after their wedding, Isaac and Elizabeth stood on the porch of their completed home, watching their permanent family, now 5 children strong, playing in the yard of what had become known as Hope Ranch. "Did you ever imagine this?" Isaac asked, his arm around her waist. "When you first came west," Elizabeth shook her head. "Never. I came to escape what I thought was the end of my dreams. Instead, I found a bigger dream than I could have conceived." Isaac's eyes crinkled with the smile that still made her heart skip. "I remember exactly when I fell in love with you," he said. "That day at the fair when you were talking to old Jim Parker about better ways to irrigate during drought. Your eyes were so passionate, your mind so quick. I thought to myself, there's a woman who sees possibilities where others see problems." Elizabeth laughed. "And I fell in love with you when you fixed my fence without making me feel helpless for needing assistance." "We make a good team, Mrs. Xavier," Isaac said, pulling her closer. "The best," she agreed, resting her head against his chest. Inside the house, the piano stood ready for the evening's music. The dining table was large enough for their growing family and any guests who might arrive unexpectedly, as often happened. Beds were made with quilts Elizabeth had stitched herself, many incorporating fabrics from the children's original home's tangible reminders of their journeys. Mama, Papa, Emma, now 11 and blossoming into a confident young girl, came running toward them. "Sheriff Porter is coming up the road, and he's got a baby with him." Isaac and Elizabeth exchanged glances, surprised but not shocked. Word had spread throughout the county and beyond about the family at Hope Ranch who took in children that needed homes. "Well," Isaac said, straightening his shoulders. "Shall we see what this is about?" Elizabeth nodded, taking his hand as they stepped off the porch to greet the sheriff. Whatever this new development might bring, they would face it together, the family they had built not through blood but through choice, commitment, and love. As the sheriff approached with a tiny bundle in his arms, Elizabeth felt not dread but anticipation. Each child who had joined their family had brought unique gifts and challenges, helping them grow in ways they never could have anticipated. "Mr. and Mrs. Xavier," Sheriff Porter called as he dismounted, carefully cradling the infant. "Sorry to intrude, but I've got a situation here." "No intrusion at all, Sheriff," Isaac replied, moving forward to assist. "What brings you our way?" The lawman looked uncharacteristically emotional as he handed the swaddled baby to Elizabeth's waiting arms. "Found this little one abandoned at the stage station. Note said the mother couldn't care for her and heard the Xaviers at Hope Ranch might be able to." Elizabeth peeled back the blanket to reveal a perfect baby girl, perhaps 3 months old, with a dusting of auburn hair and sleeping peacefully despite her circumstances. Something in Elizabeth's chest tightened and expanded simultaneously. "She's beautiful," she whispered. "We don't know her name," the sheriff said. "The note just called her my daughter and asked that she be given a good home." Isaac stepped closer, placing his hand gently on the baby's head. "She'll have that here," he said firmly, "for as long as needed." As if sensing she was being discussed, the infant opened her eyes, revealing irises of startling blue, much like Isaac's own. The coincidence made Elizabeth smile. "Hope," she said softly. "We should call her Hope." Isaac nodded, understanding the significance. Hope had brought them together, Hope had built their family, and Hope continued to guide their path forward. "Welcome home, Hope Xavier," he said, placing his arm around Elizabeth's shoulders as their other children gathered around to glimpse their newest family member. Standing there surrounded by the family they had created together, Elizabeth felt a contentment that went bone deep. The doctor's pronouncement that had once seemed like a death sentence to her dreams had instead led her on a journey to a fuller, richer life than she could have imagined. She looked up at Isaac, finding in his eyes the same gratitude and wonder that filled her own heart. They had promised to make a family anyway, and in keeping that promise, They had created something extraordinary, a home where love, not blood, defined family. As the sun set over Hope Ranch, painting the Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson, Elizabeth Xavier held her newest daughter close and thanked God for unanswered prayers and the unexpected paths they revealed.